Welcome to this Getting Started with SharePoint Framework tutorial series. And in this tutorial, we're going to create a new web part which will use the Microsoft Graph APIs to access the relevant contextual information about the user. So in this case, we're going to actually access the latest emails, what the user has received in his or her Outlook, the business email. Now, this is January 2020 edition. We're using SharePoint Framework 1.10. So if you're watching this video later on, it might be slightly changed. So please have a look on the documentation, the latest documentation. The documentation is always kept more up to date than the videos. So the documentation obviously is a link in the video description as well. Now, let's actually get started on moving on with the tutorial. So first of all, we kind of use our Windows 10 environment, which is a clean setup. There's nothing really special here. We're going to use an Edge, there's Edge Chromium installed and a Visual Studio Code installed in here. And what first we're going to do, we need to create our solution folder. So let me actually go to the location, which I'm just using a C code folder for all of the solutions which we are creating. So you can see some of the old solutions available here as well. So let's actually clean up and let's follow up on the tutorial. So we're first being requested to create a folder, and we're going to actually then store our solution. So let's do that. So cd graph APIs, now we're in the solution. And then we kind of execute the Yeoman generator in the solution and to start the creation of the SharePoint Framework solution. So obviously the basic flow is exactly the same regardless are we using REST APIs or Graph APIs. We kind of execute the Yeoman generator and then create the solution and modify the requirements or the solution structure based on our business requirements. Now, let's actually use the default solution name. We kind of target SharePoint Online. Microsoft Graph APIs are not available in on-premises because it is a cloud-dependent capability. So we're going to target SharePoint Online from that perspective. Technically, you could actually use an older versions as well and then access the APIs, but it can get slightly messy, so let's not actually worry about that one too much. We're going to use the current folder as the solution structure, and we kind of actually say yes, and that we kind of deploy the solution or the web part across the whole tenant immediately. So just super convenient way of making sure that the web part is available across the whole tenant rather than requiring that to be installed one by one on every single site. For the APIs permissions, we're not going to actually require a unique permissions. This basically means an isolation of the web part, which might be kind of irrelevant if you're accessing a lot of the graph scopes and permissions, because if you want to really make sure that another web part cannot access the access tokens on the graph APIs, which another web part is using, and then potentially you might use the yes in here. Now, in general, all of the web parts are being installed by a tenant administrator, so we definitely recommend that you understand what those web parts are and you can trust the developers of the web parts. So all of your code has been reviewed, so you don't have to have this full level of an isolation. But again, depending on the company policies, the answer in here might be yes or no. And in our case, we're going to use no, and we are targeting a web part. Now, in this case, let's actually use the web part name as my first graph web part, which actually duplicates web part on the code name, but that's fine for the demo purposes as well. And this is basically the description calling Graph APIs from SharePoint Framework, which is actually quite easy. And that's the whole point of using SharePoint Framework for these kind of a UX operations, because it's really, really convenient and that we are able to use the Graph APIs without a requirement to go to the Azure AD and request permissions and all of that stuff. So to be fair, you still need to be a tenant administrator, or tenant administrator need to grant the needed permissions which we're requesting, but let's actually go through that process slightly later on the tutorial. So which framework are we going to use? We're going to use Node JavaScript framework as the default scaffolding option, which will then create the default solution for us without any specific JavaScript framework being used. Again, any framework in the world can be used pretty much on the SharePoint framework. There is no limitation. So this doesn't mean that it's only React and Knockout being supported. No. Any framework in the world is actually supported with SharePoint Framework. Now, let's actually speed up the video after the scaffolding is completed and continue from there. Good, and now our scaffolding is completed. So let's actually clean up the windows slightly, and we can actually start up the Visual Studio Code already. But before we actually start modifying the code, let's add some types and settings available in the solution. So let me actually get back still on the command line. And then we're going to run npm install add Microsoft Graph types. And this is going to basically include us the TypeScript types when we're doing development, so that we have the better intelligence as part of the development experience. So let's actually make that one happen. So it doesn't take too long actually at that install that one as part of the solution. And that's going to be then installing the needed solutions and packages and assets to the node modules folder. And there we go. Now, what's actually interesting, or what we need to do next, is really concentrate on the configuration of the solution. So first of all, we are looking into creating a web port which is listing some emails. So basically, our requirement is to get access on emails. And depending on your business requirements, you need to have a different set of permissions and scopes granted against the operations within a Microsoft Graph. Where we actually control those settings is our package solution. So basically the package solution JSON is the one which is packaged together with SPPKG file, the actual solution which contains the assets and JavaScript files. And then when we install that on the tenant, we actually, for example, grant or request to grant the permissions around the graph for web API or custom APIs as an example. So you can definitely also, it's not just about the graph, you can call a securely a custom web API which is hosted in Azure, so you can get business relevant information for you. The graph is absolutely an awesome option as well. So how do we do this in practice is that we actually include a web API permission requests entry in here in this solution, package solution to JSON. So in here, we're basically right now in this case, we're saying we are requesting scope mail.read from Microsoft Graph object or application. And that's then is required to get approved before our solution can actually successfully operate. So behind of the scenes, when we approve this permission, we actually grant the permissions for any SharePoint Framework solution to read the mail.read or access the mail.read scope. Now, if we would use the domain isolated option, we would only create a dynamically an application and grant only permissions for that particular web part or that particular solution. So that's one interesting option to consider. Let's not worry about that too much in this tutorial. There is additional documentation available what it means in practice if you're not quite up to date on all of those options. But in this case, let's concentrate on actually getting to top 5 or latest emails from the user. So we can actually request a scope mail.read because we're looking into reading the email of the particular user. Now, then we're going to go do our web part code, really simple web part. So we're not going to make this super pretty, not the styles, the actual web part code. And in here, we're going to include 2 different imports. So we're going to include here import for our SP HTTP because we're going to use the Microsoft Graph client, which again is super convenient object, which actually takes care of the header settings and access tokens and everything behind the scenes. So you as a developer, you don't need to worry about where do I get the token, how do I set that token to the REST API calls and headers and settings and all of that. Everything is abstracted from you, so you're able to just say Microsoft Graph client, give me all of the emails, and then we can operate from there. What it also does, it encapsulates well, actually, we behind of the scenes, we're also encapsulating the Graph JavaScript SDK, and I'll show what that means in practice when we're chasing the code. So let me actually go back in here. Let's get rid of the default entry in the render because we're not interested on that one, and let's modify that one slightly. So I'm going to actually copy the whole render which we have in the tutorial and paste that one in. And then let's actually walk through what happens in here. So in the render method, we are accessing this.context and Microsoft Graph client factory. We're getting the client, which is basically giving us essentially the JavaScript Microsoft Graph JavaScript SDK. So the notation and the way we access the information is using the same as the Graph JavaScript SDK because, well, behind the scenes, we're using the Graph JavaScript SDK. So in here, we're basically then defining what is the API which we're hitting and meets slash messages. We're reading the messages. We are taking top 5 from there, ordered by receive date time desk. And all of the settings, attributes, properties, what are we getting there is available in the Graph documentation. So I'm not going to, again, deep dive on all of those assets. But basically what we're saying here is that give me top 5 messages ordered by receive date time desk. So the latest 5 emails which I have in my inbox. And then we're rendering some entry here, and we have this list container available. So we're adding there a div where we will be then embedding the list of emails in a simplistic way. Sure, we could do this in a much more sophisticated way using Office UI Fabric or whatever rendering mechanism, but let's keep things simple as we want to just make sure that basics are working, and then you can extend on top of this basic scenario. Now, you can see that the render email list is currently still missing. So let's actually include that function in the web part. And here we go, and paste that one in. There's interesting intent problem with that one as well. Apparently part of the SharePoint Framework 1.10, with there's a small things on the intents, but let's get that one fixed in the future versions. Now, let's concentrate what we do here. Render email list, which is called from render. We are getting basically the list of messages which we are actually getting from this Graph SDK call. So what's really cool about this one, you don't need to worry about the headers, you don't need to worry about access tokens, all of that is being abstracted from you as long as those permissions have been granted and as long as the basic setup has been followed up. And we'll get back on how do we grant those permissions slightly later on the tutorial. But we're getting that, we're getting the list of messages, and the messages.value is actually the array of Microsoft Graph messages, and then the message collection, we're basically just doing a list or rendering the list of those messages and getting the description, getting actually the subject of that message and rendered in a list. So quite simple, but we can at least see the list of the latest emails coming from a particular user. So pretty cool. Then we're getting the instance, the SB list container that was basically that div over there. And then we're injecting that HTML which we created here as part of the inner HTML of that div, which hopefully makes sense how we are now extending dynamically the DOM structure of that particular web part. Good, and that's actually it for making the needed changes. A super simple thing. So let's actually get back on our console. Let's do a full round trip. So let me actually clear this one. Full round trip or full installation by running gulp and bundle. And that's the ship, so I don't actually have to have anything running in my local host. And that's going to bundle the web part. I'm just going to double check that I saved. Yes, I saved the changes, and there would be a small marker over there. I have a bad habit of doing changes and then forget about saving them. And then you're wondering, why isn't it working? And probably not the only one who's having that problem every now and then. Now, gulp baggage solution, -ship is the other command. So now we are creating the actual SharePoint solution. We can see that pop in here. And there is our solution Graph APIs SDK, which we can then install to our app catalog and test things up. So I'm going to reveal that solution SPPKT file in Explorer. There we go. And I'm going to open up my tenant. In my case, I've had it in my dev box as a default entry. And because I use well-known URLs in every single tenant which I use, I remember that I know that the app catalog is in the apps URL. And in our case, we actually have here one web part already available, the Hello World web part from the previous tutorials, which we've been playing around and testing within this environment. But hey, we can have as many web parts in the app catalog as needed. So I'm going to drag and drop the Graph APIs in, and then we have additional things which we need to consider. Now, few things to notice here. We wanted this to be a tenant deployed web part. So basically this option is then available. So to make this solution available in all of the sites of organization. So let's actually click that one. More importantly, actually, there's the please go to App Management page to approve pending permissions. There are permissions that need to be reviewed. Microsoft Graph, email read. So basically the setting in our Visual Studio or package solution JSON. Let's get back in here and on the config file and in here. This one in here is starting the process inside of SharePoint Online that, hey, well, we have this requirement of actually approving mail.read permission. This web part will not work until this operation has been, or this permission have been granted. Now, you could actually grant these permissions beforehand using PowerShell, so that is definitely an option, so you don't have to wait until the solution gets in to go to the admin UIs. But okay, let's note that one. Click deploy. Double check that we don't have any exceptions. Looking good, no errors. It's still not deployed. It's deployed. Everything is looking good. Now we need to go to the admin UI, and the easiest way and the fastest way to go to the SharePoint admin UI was the fact that we actually extend the URL with a -admin. Oh, what did I do? Let's actually get back in here. I added in one additional 0 there. Oop. So let's go -admin. And that's going to then redirect us to the SharePoint Admin Center. In the Admin Center, we extend the Advanced option, and we go to the App Manager, and we can actually then see the pending approvals of those requested permissions which have not yet been approved. There's a few settings here and a few different options, which again, depending on your tenant status. We are right now asking organizational-wide permissions to mail read, and this means that any SharePoint Framework solution using the graph object will be able to access that kind of a scope. Now, if the solution, if we wanted to have a isolated solution where the permission are only granted for that particular SharePoint Framework solution, then it would not be an organizational-wide request. It would be a solution-specific request. But in this organization, we have decided that mail read, yeah, that's completely fine. We don't consider that as a massive deal because it's the user who's anyway accessing. It's the particular user's permission. So it's a delegated permission. It's not that you can read everybody's email in the organization. No, that's not what it means. It means that the particular user accessing the signed in, authenticated, accessing SharePoint Online can read their own email. That's what it actually means. And then we're going to do approve. And we're going to approve or reject access. There's the request, and we're going to approve the permission. And that's going to then move that permission to the organizational-wide section under the approved. So we can actually say that the mail read has been approved. And this means that we can actually test out how our web part will work in practice. So let's actually do that. So let me go back in here. Let me go, for example, the group site. The group site is just something what I use for testing always. Again, I have a bad habit of using always the same URLs, which for me helps on remembering what are the things which are always available in my tenants. Now, let's use this. The name could be Graph APIs. And because, again, we use the tenant-wide deployment option, our web part is available across the whole tenant. And that means that if I go here and write Graph, we can say the web part in the web part list. It is using the default icons and all of that. We didn't change that. Getting that one visible there. And we can actually see the list of emails which we have actually coming from the inbox. So from the user's inbox in the Microsoft Graph, in the Outlook. And we can actually double check that one as well, that if I go here and if I go to my Outlook, we can set the list of emails is available here. They say I actually sent those emails personally to myself, and so that's why we're getting certain set of duplicates and entries. But hey, it is what it is for the demo purposes at least. But that's it. We are able to access the emails and the contextual information of the particular user using the Graph APIs. And obviously, you can create much more sophisticated solutions, much more nicer rendering, much more accessing all of the information which are available in the Microsoft Graph. So using the particular user's kind of identity as a central starting point, but there's so much more available. It's not just about the emails, not just about calendar, not just about the basic setup. There's a lot of APIs available. You can access the task, you can manage the task, but also there's out-of-the-box task management as well. You can combine multiple different information using the Graph APIs. And it's all really easily available for you when you're implementing your solutions using Microsoft Graph. Maybe one point to remember, I touched this on the introduction, when we were actually approving our request and the actual request of the permission package solution, domain read permission in the tenant admin UIs, you will need to be a tenant administrator. You need to be a global administrator to grant that permission because you are actually operating against the Azure AD. Now, it's a one-time operation. It doesn't mean that the user who's actually using the web port have to be an administrator. No. It's around the fact that you are going to that UI, you grant the permission, and then you're good to go. It's a one-time operation for making things happen. But that's it for this particular tutorial, talking about the options. Really easy. We're using the JavaScript SDK for Graph, accessing the information. You can really easily access any of the scopes as long as you request the scopes beforehand. You can isolate the requests if needed as well. And there's plenty of additional documentation around the Microsoft Graph and using that in our documentation as well. And if something is missing, please do let us know. Thank you.